good evening to one and all. Welcome back to Studio One. We are honored to have with us Dr. Shashi Tharoor and Professor Suhas Palshikar to discuss on Dr. Tharoor's latest book, The Battle of Belonging. Welcome to both of you at PILF. Dr. Shashi Tharoor, a third-term Member of Parliament for Thiruvananthapuram, is the best-selling author of 22 books, both fiction and non-fiction. Besides being a former Under Secretary for the United Nations and a former Minister of State for the Human Resource Development and for External Affairs in the Government of India, he has won numerous prizes, including a Commonwealth Writers' Prize. In 2019, Dr. Tharoor was also awarded the Sahitya Academy Award in the category of English non-fiction for his book, An Era of Darkness. He chairs the Parliament's Standing Committee on Information and Technology. Professor Suhas Palshikar taught political science from 1978 all the way to 2016. He is the co-director of Lokniti, a research program on comparative democracy, and the chief editor of a biannual journal bought out by SAGE. He was also editor of Samaj Prabodhan Patrika during 1990 all the way to 2004. He is associated with National Election Study since the 1996 elections. Professor Palshikar writes on contemporary politics and on the theme of democratic politics in India. Professor Palshikar has been a visiting fellow at University of Chicago and Brown University. I now request Professor Palshikar to begin this very interesting and very awaited discussion.
Thank you, Tanmay. Welcome, Dr. Tharoor. It's a great pleasure. It's a great pleasure to be in conversation with you, and it would have been much, much greater a pleasure if we had been together on the same dais. But unfortunately, this is going to be a virtual conversation. For the purpose of our benefit of our viewers, this is the book that we are going to discuss, The Battle of Belonging, which is quite a daunting book. Dr. Tharoor, I must say that my heart is much with the argument of the book, but my head pushes me into some cynical questioning, and I hope you will bear with that. I agree with you entirely, and I must alert our audience to what the book is talking about. The book begins briefly with a discussion of the theories and ideology of nationalism. Then it turns to the question of India's own variety of nationalism, going into the problem that this nationalism is facing contemporarily. And in the last two sections, the book tries to resolve these contradictory pulls and pushes by making a particular proposition to which I will come to. So, Dr. Tharoor, the way I am going to start this conversation is to begin with very small issues within the ambit of agreement that I have with you and the argument of the book. Because after all, this is a battle worth engaging in.
Yes.
Anyone who loves India and cares for its future should read this book, ponder over the points that he has made in the book, and maybe fight with him also, because that is the points that he makes, that unless we fight with each other and try to reconcile our different viewpoints, we probably might not survive as a democratic nation. But anyway, the first two questions, which you might respond very briefly, perhaps, because as I said, these are not really matters of dispute, but maybe our audience would get a better sense of what you are trying to say. Let me take our audience, therefore, to the bang end of the book. It is in the last part of the book that you quote Ernest Renan and say that nationalism, among other things, also means shared sorrow, sharing others' sorrow. And I want you to bring to this point right at the beginning, because my question is, are we currently in a position really to share the sorrow of others as a community, as a society, as a political community, as a society? Are we really in a position to share sorrows, or for our convenience, are we narrowing the idea of what we are and then sharing only the sorrows of that selective community?
Well, I'd like to think there is still a spirit of solidarity in the country. I mean, the classic instance is the migrant worker situation. For many people in educated, urban, middle class India, these were people whom they associated with very often daily. They were domestic servants, chaiwalas, fruit sellers, of course, also factory workers and so on, we don't see daily. But nonetheless, they were taken for granted. And then suddenly, when the lockdown happened, and these people were left abruptly by the government to fend for themselves, and many of them, realizing they had no alternative, started the long trudge back to the villages from whence they had come. I think the entire nation's imagination was seized with the realization that these fellow citizens of ours were suffering because of the heedlessness and thoughtlessness of the government, but that their suffering was a reminder to us of our shared obligations to them. They had lived and worked amongst us. They had been cast off into the wilds, as it were. And I think as a result, the response of many, whether it was a response to the expression of compassion in media or in social media, or whether it was a response ranging from setting up free kitchens to arranging camps to donating chappals to people whose footwear had worn out, all of these things were being done spontaneously. It shows there is still a capacity to experience and feel sorrow within the parameters of our national Indian identity. At the same time, one would argue that the government showed a surprising lack of compassion and a surprising lack of, if you like, the emotional ability to share the sorrow of those they had heedlessly forgotten about when they launched their lockdown and made the decisions they made. But the imagination of India has not yet abandoned all its constituent parts.
And it's great that you pointed out this problem that the government couldn't share their sorrow, because that's precisely where I want to take you to the second part of the question, which is that you also mention, you quote of course, but then you mention that it's the duty of the citizen to be the nuisance to the government of the day. And again there, a small question. Democracy allows us and in a sense facilitates this capacity to be a nuisance. What happens if that capacity is not facilitated? Don't you think that we are at a cusp where, because this capacity is not facilitated, citizens are really pushed towards acquiescence, towards becoming docile citizens, as I have said earlier? Or do you still think that we have the nerve, the resilience, and the persistence to be really nuisance? And not just you, because you are in the opposition, or I have retired, so the government probably, except arresting me, can't do much about me. But there are lakhs and lakhs of citizens who need to be a nuisance. Would they have this capacity posited by our democracy?
Professor Palshikar Saab, I have to say that for me, there is mounting concern, which I've expressed in the book, about the increasing delegitimization of dissent by our government. And as a result of that, the increasing pressure on people to conform rather than be a nuisance. As you say rightly, there are some like you and me who have taken it upon ourselves almost as our civic duty to challenge and question and critique the decisions being taken in our name by the government that seeks to rule us. But at the same time, there are very many who have concluded that because of this government's active dislike and rejection of disagreement, they would rather be conformist rather than challenge the government at some cost to themselves. And what we are seeing as a result of that, I'm afraid, is particularly evident in one area, and that is the increasing hollowing out of institutions that were designed in theory to be independent or autonomous, that were to a greater or lesser degree more or less autonomous. Some were less autonomous than we would have liked, some were more so than the government would have liked, but they were still functioning in accordance with those principles enshrined in the Constitution. All of them suddenly seem to be being brought to heel more and more under the present government. In the almost 7 years of this government's rule, what we are seeing is a systematic erosion of that kind of autonomy and independence, which means at the end of the day that their own capacity constitutionally to be a nuisance essentially will cease to exist. So if the Election Commission feels that there is a price to be paid by a commissioner who gives an unfavorable ruling to the ruling party and particularly its leadership, or if the Reserve Bank of India feels that the price for disagreeing with the wishes of the government's finance ministries for a governor to have to resign, or if the Supreme Court judges feel that certain decisions are expected of them in certain cases are best not heard till many years after they have come up and been submitted, and so on and so forth. We have examples, many in the book, many around us in our politics and our society. Then the result would be a reduced capacity, if you like, to fulfill the democratic duty of being a nuisance. And ultimately for this government, individuals can be disposed of. I mean, we know so many cases of people who have had to endure income tax raids, if that's their vulnerable point. In my case, I have 4 cases filed against me in the courts, which tie me up, take up a lot of my time, make me pay lawyers' fees. This has been going on for years. I'm sure the government and its agents, in some of the cases, were filed quite openly by BJP office bearers rather than by the government itself. The point I'm making is that all of these options exist to indicate to people there is a price to be paid for being a nuisance. And therefore, many will say, I'm not prepared to pay the price. I'm going to shut up. Why should I exercise my democratic rights? For what? If I'm going to suffer, I will speak for the nation as a whole. But what is the satisfaction of that if I'm going to suffer? And as a result, we are seeing, I believe, a greater direction of conformity and a gradual erosion of democracy and of institutional autonomy that underpins democracy.
Right. And that is where, in a sense, the audience should get the sense of what kind of agreement about your argument exists between us. But lest it be felt that we are simply echoing each other, I would now begin to ask you 2 questions at least, if time permits, about where I thought that the book probably could have gone further and done something more than what it does, or something different from what it does. The first is there is a long discussion of Hindutva. Obviously, that was necessary because your point of departure was what we are and how we are seen differently by different perspectives. For any student of Hindutva politics, that would be a very excellent summary as to how it began and how, for example, there were differences between Golwalkar and Savarkar. What, however, struck me as strange is that there is almost no, or probably just one passing mention of Devras. I thought personally, as a student of Hindutva politics, that Devras actually is the catalyst of today's Hindutva in ideological terms, who sort of connects these 2 streams of, on the one hand, an orthodox Hindutva of Golwalkar and a modernist Hindutva of Savarkar. Similarly, and that's why I'm putting it together with that, you jump onto the contemporary, or rather the current moment, and your current moment in a sense begins with what the present Prime Minister and the present leadership of the BJP has been doing. But what would you say about the late 1980s and the 90s, when actually this genie was taken out of the bottle by Advani, for example? And therefore, don't you think that in any assessment of Hindutva historically, these 2 moments, the Devras moment of the 1970s and the Advani moment of the 1980s, 90s, need to be chronicled much more ruthlessly than probably the book has done?
Interesting question, because this was not an accidental omission. In my own view, the 3 most important intellectual contributions, and I will explain it in a minute, which are the ones I've summarized, were from Savarkar, who invented the concept of Hindutva, Golwalkar, who developed it and was the longest serving Sarsanchalak of the RSS, and Deen Dayal Upadhyay, who of course had a major shift from being an RSS ideologue to being the organizational leader of the Bharatiya Jansangh, the forerunner of today's BJP. And you may remember during the centenary of Upadhyay, Narendra Modi saying that he considered Upadhyay to be his mentor, his guru, his intellectual inspiration. Devras, I would say, his 2 principal contributions, and I've read many of his speeches, and so one was something which is now so taken for granted that I don't consider it such a major breakthrough, which is his famous speech denouncing untouchability. I mean, today, who is going to defend untouchability? Golwalkar was definitely more of a casteist. but there was a speech in Pune, as it happens, in May
Yes, sir.
74, in which he denounced untouchability and asked the RSS volunteers to work towards its removal, was one major contribution by him. And the other one was what I have subsequently put in more recent terms in Mohan Bhagwat's argument, that our definition of Hindu Rashtra is not limited to any particular faith. All religions can form part of Hindu Rashtra. That was actually, it would have, quoting Devras would have merely meant essentially having to repeat it all when I talked about Mr. Bhagwat's attempts in the last couple of years to try and communicate a certain more liberal version of Hindu Rashtra. So those two ideas, I felt, added nothing to my particular analysis. As you yourself implicitly said, Professor Palshikar, my argument in the book was about nationhood and nationalism. So how our classic anti-colonial nationalism converted itself into a civic nationalism as enshrined in the Constitution, and I try and describe why the nationalism of the Constitution is indeed civic national, the granting of equal rights to all, irrespective of background, religion, caste, language, region, etc. And how the counter to that idea is the Hindutva idea. One must never forget that Savarkar and Golwalkar and Upadhyay, who were all alive when the Constitution was adopted, all rejected it from the start. And all three had many critiques, but the most significant common critique was expressed by all three of them in different language. But I thought Upadhyay put it very clearly. He said, this constitution seems to assume that India is a territory, the nation of India is a territory called India, and the constitution is written for all the people on it. Wrong, he says, a nation is not a territory, a nation is a people. And the people of India are the Hindu people. End of story. So that was the crystallization, it seemed to me, of the argument of Hindu Rashtra. And I honestly thought that going into Devras would have been an unnecessary sidetracking. Perhaps I should have acknowledged, as you say, I only mentioned him once, I should have acknowledged this in 2 sentences at least, and that as a Punekar, you probably have a certain amount of concerns about that. But honestly, I think the substance of the analysis, this omission doesn't detract from it. At the end of the day, where we both come out, I think clearly, is that the alternative idea of India represented by Hindu Rashtra, by the slogan Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan, by the entire organizational logic of the RSS, and therefore of the training imparted to all the people who are now the leaders of our country. I mean, we for the first time in our history, the first 3 constitutional positions in the country are all held by former RSS members. And though not all the cabinet is former RSS, certainly a significant weighty percentage of the cabinet is. And of course, we do have the extraordinary phenomenon of the cabinet trooping to Nagpur every year to be essentially giving an oral report card to the RSS and being given their marching orders when they leave. So you've got a very unusual situation where the very prime minister who upholds the constitution, which is a liberal constitution, a secular constitution, or a constitution that upholds pluralism and civic nationalism, that prime minister essentially embodies and breeds an idea of Indian nationhood that is fundamentally opposed to the implications of our constitution. And that, to my mind, is where the real disagreement is.
Sure, but then I also thought that this discussion gives a lot of credit to the current leadership and forgets about Advani. If that moment had not happened, I thought perhaps the challenge that civic nationalism faces today could have been much more sober or easier to handle.
You're right. Again, circumstances dictated that, in the sense that when Advani was in a position to really affect all our lives as Home Minister and Deputy Prime Minister of India, it was under, number one, a more conciliatory-minded leader in Vajpayee, and number two, in a coalition government with the BJP at 183 seats. The only other Hindutva party in the 23-party coalition was the Shiv Sena, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, had fewer than 10 seats. And that was it. So there was no way that either of them could have seriously implemented a Hindu Rashtra agenda. Had they won a bigger majority in 2004, as many of them thought they would, perhaps you might have seen a forerunner of what Narendra Modi and Amit Shah have offered the country since 2014. But as we know, in 2004, they lost instead. But what's interesting about that whole Advani-Vajpayee period is essentially how little difference it made. There were some appointments of Hindutva ideologues in certain places, certain institutions, certain positions of significance, the Vice Presidency of India, places like that. But at the end of the day, they were not able to be too ambitious in their efforts. And even those appointments inevitably were to positions that lapsed or expired. And the ability to look back on Vajpayee-Advani as a period in which Hindu Rashtra gained a significant hold on India, that ability, I think, does not exist. You cannot truly say that that under Vajpayee and Advani, the country changed in any significant degree, a difference of kind. Maybe a difference of degree for a little bit, but there was no difference of kind between the India pre-Vajpayee and the India post-Vajpayee. Whereas with Modi Shah, and particularly since 2014, you are witnessing a difference of kind. It's no longer a difference of degree. I'm sorry, particularly since 2019 is what I wanted to say. Since 2014, and particularly since the re-election, you are seeing a difference of kind, not just a degree. And you yourself are amongst those who have suggested that we may actually be witnessing the birth of a second republic. That the original Republic of India and all its basic assumptions, frankly, is not the republic that these people think they're running. Now, Advani cannot be either credited or blamed for anything remotely like that.
Fair point. But let me now come to the more important, let's say, disagreement that I have. Not really disagreement, but I would like to problematize. In the last part of the book, you give a little more detailed discussion of your idea of patriotism as a possible alternative to the poison that a certain kind of nationalism may instill. That is a very fascinating discussion. But at the end of it, I thought, was it only a semantic difference? Because patriotism, as you yourself also point out, has this potential of getting distorted. And as far as getting distorted is concerned, any idea can be distorted and can be misused from the purpose for which it was originally conceived. I was much more persuaded by the argument that it is the Constitution and our national struggle, freedom movement, that gives us a sense of nationalism, which is, as you throughout the book call, civic nationalism. The trouble with both these terms, nationalism and patriotism, Dr. Tharoor, and your first part of the discussion actually shows in the book also, that the theorizations that have taken place on the basis of European experience. Now, Indian experience. And let us therefore probably get away from that distinction between the two. And why can't we, for example, emphasize that our Indian being is much more spatial, not because of its patriotism, but because of its multiple identities.
Yes, well, that is very much my argument, and there I think you and I would agree. But let me briefly defend my distinction, because to my mind, patriotism is about loving your country because it is yours, because you belong to it and it belongs to you. The way you would love your mother without claiming she is perfect. Whereas the nationalism being promoted in India today by the present government is a totalizing vision that excludes those who don't subscribe to it, that demands allegiance and brooks no dissent. As I write in the book, patriotism and nationalism are different because a patriot, both may be prepared to die for their country, but while a patriot is prepared to die for his country, a nationalist is ready to kill for his state. And that is an important distinction. Now, with civic nationalism, I'm talking about nationalism anchored not in identity, which means not religion, ethnicity, language, any other immutable markers that you're born into, but in constitutions and institutions, where all citizens are treated equally, irrespective of identity, and differences amongst us are accepted and respected. And as you know, that's the nationalism I argue for in the book. And I talk about patriotism in a very clearly emotional sense. I talk about the kind of, how can I put it, Jawaharlal Nehru being reduced to tears by hearing Lata Mangeshkar sing "Hai Mere Watan Ke Logon," or one of us perhaps, being moved to nostalgia by a certain smell or a certain association, a certain item of clothing, a certain cultural gesture, a certain food item, a piece of music. All of those things go into the kind of local patriotisms that cumulatively make up the civic nationalism of India. I would argue that today's government has appropriated the term nationalism in a way that makes it almost a dirty word. I mean, you're right. Nationalism led to the long, successful struggle for independence. There was a nationalism deeply rooted in India's time-honored civilizational traditions of inclusivity, of social justice, of religious tolerance, and the desire to forge a society that allowed individuals to flourish, regardless of any barriers coming from their birth, their background, their identity. Whereas now, when the ruling party speaks of nationalism, they mean an exclusionary, aggressive, sectarian nationalism. And that's why it fits in within the European idea of ethno-religious nationalism. Because for me, I'm saying I reject ethno-religious nationalism. I support my Indian civic nationalism. And I believe that love and inclusivity remain at the heart of what it means to be an Indian patriot.
Same question, a little further perhaps, is this. Does it not mean that the real quarrel that people like you and I probably would have with the Hindutva kind of nationalism would be more about the project of homogenization rather than the project of loving your culture, loving your country, loving your countrymen and women? And it is this homogenization which I think your book brings out very effectively. And that's why my trouble is that if it is brought out, then why is it not theorized? Why can't you say that non-homogeneous nationalism is actually the Indian contribution to the idea of what nationalism is about?
Well, I mean, I would argue that I can leave the theorizing to scholars like yourself, because I am, in fact, describing that. I was an explicit sentence saying that their idea of nationalism privileges uniformity, whereas my idea of nationalism privileges unity. And they're not the same thing. That I distinguish in my book between secular, voluntary, and inclusive civic nationalism versus exclusionary, absolutist, and often dangerous ethno-religious nationalism. And I argue in the battle of belonging that it's the kind of nationalism I'm describing that best safeguards individual rights, and that's why I want to promote and protect it above all others, because that would be inclusive, and that would essentially protect all the patriots of our country who love our country and who want to feel pride in it. Whereas what the monolithic version of Hindu Rashtra would do would be, first of all, would exclude everybody who doesn't subscribe to that idea, would also increasingly start excluding those who don't speak Hindi, so the South and the Northeast and so on are going to worry. Then it would also exclude those who do not accept this sort of very monolithic version of Hinduism, of Hindu identity, and therefore of Indianness that the ruling party is trying to promote. And certainly there's an issue of subnational, ethno-national identities. I've argued in the book, as you remember, Professor Palshikar, that there is really no majority community in our country. Every one of us, in one way or the other, belongs to a minority. And therefore, seeing that being exploited for political reasons is one kind of story. But the other kind of story is that we need to recognize that because there is so much of difference amongst us, it's only a plural nationalism that keeps us all together. One where you feel that it doesn't matter whether you're a Gujarati or a Malayali, you're a Hindu or a Muslim, whether you're your features look one way or another, whether your skin is dark or light, whether you speak Mizo or you speak Malayalam. I mean, all of this should not be a handicap in a truly civic nationalist India, as provided for in the constitution given to us by our great founding fathers and mothers all the way back 70 years ago. And if we accept that, then what we are talking about is indeed a plural version of nationalism. So if you like, I've described all of that. And if you were to write a nice column saying that this is a theory that he has not come up with, I will come up with a theory, I'd be grateful to you.
No, thank you very much. But, sometimes I feel that we academics made a mistake of judging what a particular concept is from what the Europeans theorized from their own experience. But the same mistake has also probably been committed by these ultra-nationalists, or who call themselves the true nationalists in India, that they also look at Europe in order to understand what nationalism should be. And the origin, therefore, of Hindu nationalism, in the sense, goes to that imitating Europe and creating a self by creating the other.
I agree with you so much. In fact, that is one of the themes of my book, Why I'm a Hindu, because I describe Hinduism as I understand it and as I've grown up with it, as I've practiced it, and as I've read about it. And I quote extensively from the ancient texts and particularly from the interpretations of people like Adi Shankara and Swami Vivekananda. And I conclude that, in fact, Hindutva as a doctrine is profoundly un-Hindu. It's profoundly anti-Hindu because it actually seeks to Semitize the interpretation of a faith that is so eclectic. Hinduism is a faith that does not only not claim to be the only true religion in the world, it does not even claim to have any settled idea of divine. In fact, the reason we have 333 million forms of God is because the sages recognize that since God essentially is unvisualizable, we are free to visualize him, her, it as we may see fit. And that's why if you want to imagine God as a 10-armed woman riding a tiger, that's fine. If you want to imagine God as a bleeding man suffering on a cross, that's also fine. And that's something which is uniquely Hindu. We are a religion made of extraordinary pluralism and diversity, and these people have tried to Semitize it and make it a religion of one book, one God, one way of worship, one set of rituals. It's absurd, but that is what the Hindutva movement has reduced Hinduism to. In the same way, they are applying this kind of mentality to Indian nationalism. And I've argued that, Hinduism that I respect is inclusive and non-judgmental. Hindutva is a political doctrine that doesn't even really understand Hinduism philosophically and is rooted in the idea of exclusion. So I would argue that we are not only not offering from this side of the political fence a watered down version of the BJP's political messaging, as we've been accused of Hindutva light and so on. I would argue that we are actually fundamentally opposed to Hindutva, while being, many of us as individuals, being very proud of our Hinduism as the personal concern of every individual. So, I mean, this is something which, to my mind, is such an important distinction, and it spills over into the politics of pluralism or lack thereof as well.
So the battle of belonging, in a sense, is also a battle about one's own religion as far as the Hindus are concerned, or for that matter, even Muslims are concerned. Would you say that, therefore, this is not merely a political, ideological battle to be fought in the realm of formal politics, but also in the realm of ideas and religion? Though the book doesn't touch upon this, and your other book, Why I Am a Hindu, actually touches upon that, I thought that this question, in a sense, connects to what you are saying.
Totally correct. But in many ways, I mean, one of the points I do make is that there is actually a spillover. On the one hand, whereas I've talked about Hinduism and Hindutva both in the book and in my previous answer, my argument is, of course, that Hinduism is inclusive of multiple ways of worship, while Hindutva is actually indifferent to devotion and cares principally about identity, communal identity, rather than faith. That Hinduism is actually open to reform and progress, which is why it has 4,000 years it survived, whereas Hindutva is reactionary and regressive, and its roots are in the racial pride ethos that spawned fascism in the 1920s, which is why I would argue it's highly unlikely to outlast its current peak in this century. Now, electoral politics has at the same time complicated matters, because one could argue that the quest for an electoral majority has driven much of this Hindutva majoritarianism. Because the old formula in politics was you construct a majority out of a coalition of minorities. So you take, Brahmins, Harijans, Muslims, Yadav, whatever it be, you create a coalition and you win. The ruling party says, let's just harp on the Hindu identity, subsuming differences of caste, region, language, and gender. All Hindus, if even half of all the Hindus vote for us, we'll keep winning. And then we marginalize members of minority groups and we don't give them any chance to get a foothold in the majority base. Now, that is, of course, politically very dangerous for India also. But that is what is sustaining this Hindutva nationalism, because there's a political logic behind Hindutva nationalism. So, in fact, I would argue that it is implicit and in some places explicit in my analysis in the last third of the book, that this is also the game that is afoot, you see. And therefore, the petty politicization of identity it seems to me, is a threat to our nationhood because it divides rather than unites.
Thank you. Now we have enough time for questions and answers. But before we turn to those questions and answers, I can't resist putting you into the sort of position of telling us what probably might be, as I expect, a sequel to this. There is a and the speed with which you write, Dr. Tharoor, I am sure you must have already thought of this, but there is a mention in the book. You use a phrase, India's redemption. I would like you to, before we turn to questions and answers, take your time to actually tell us a little more about what you thought when you use this term, India's redemption. One clue that I got from the earlier discussion that we had just now is this idea of plurality and a country of, let's say, minorities. It's a cliche to say that all of us are minorities, but the point is that all of us are what we are. That's what you, in a sense, imagine. But you, at the same time, must be knowing that you can't go back into history to construct the future. The future will be future. And therefore, what kind of future you see? We are at the cusp of concluding a decade, a very eventful decade. And particularly last 5 years of this decade have been very traumatic if you are a Democrat and a nationalist in India. Both democracy is on the back foot and nationalism is being distorted, as you argue in your book. In this context, and with the optimism of your idea of India's redemption, what do you see if you were asked to gaze into the crystal ball for the next 10 years?
Well, I believe that we have to fight for it. It's not going to fall into our laps. If we want redemption,
that's what you say in the book.
That is the battle of belonging. If we want every Indian to feel the sense of belonging that really matters in constructing a viable and successful nation, then we do need absolutely to ensure that in our own country, we actually lead this fight. It's a political fight as well as in many ways, it is a battle for what's good and precious and noble about the But to come back to what you said, I mean, when you really look at pluralism in India, it is merely conceding to every Indian the right to be whoever he or she is. I've argued in an earlier book that the magic of Indianness is that you can be a good Malayali, a good Muslim, and a good Indian all at once. And that would apply to any other kind of formula you want to come up with. You can be a good Dalit, a good Bihari, and a good Indian all at once also. I mean, the point I'm making is we, as an Indian nation, have acknowledged, respected, and accepted multiple identities for our people. And that multiplicity of identities offers each person, each individual, the possibility of self-fulfillment. Equally, of course, in politics, there are also material tasks to be fulfilled. We have to do a lot more about what I've called elsewhere the software of development, namely the human capital, education, sanitation, healthcare, all of these things, which fortunately have once again come high up on the national agenda thanks to this awful pandemic. But the need to invest in the things that make human beings survive and flourish. But apart from those material things, they need a sense of belonging to be able to participate in this exercise of national redemption. And I genuinely believe that this experiment concluded between 47 and 50 in the Constitution, that experiment cannot and should not in any shape or form be allowed to go extinct. It was far too precious and noble an achievement to be abandoned at the altar of the political expediency of those who are currently leading the Bharatiya Janata Party. I might say that in many ways, I know many people in that party, including in government, who do not subscribe to the extreme manifestations of this form of majoritarianism that sadly exists and that you and I would be writing about and rejecting. But at the same time, the leadership of the party is undoubtedly taking the country in a certain direction. The Home Minister's statement in Parliament when I was present, and I challenged him on it, that essentially not only piloted the CAA, but threatened or promised, whichever way you look at it, a nationwide NRC to accompany it. That was such a blatantly clear signal of intent to essentially exclude 16% of our population from the benefits of Indian nationhood. To my mind, this became a fundamentally serious challenge to everything that was achieved over 3 years of debates in the Constituent Assembly. And this is why I believe we need to fight to regain that soul of India that has been so gravely tarnished in the course of the last 6 years.
Yes, fight we need to, but again, taking you back to the point I made, is there a snapping of this link between democracy and nationalism? That we first began to believe that these are two, for the first time in a sense in last 7 decades, we are starting to believe that as if these two are different roots, whereas what you call as civic nationalism is actually predicated on a combination of the two.
I agree. In fact, I do stress in the book that, first of all, civic nationalism is a voluntary nationalism. You want to belong to a nation and you subscribe to it, as it were. Something, by the way, that someone like Deen Dayal Upadhyay would explicitly reject. He actually said another flaw in the Constitution, he said, is that it's like members getting together and forming a club. And his almost mystical idea of the Hindu nation is that you're simply born into it. There is no question of subscribing to nationalism. And that is a fundamental distinction between their idea of what a nation is and my idea of a nation emerging from and sanctified by a constitution. There is an irreparable gap. So in my idea of civic nationalism, or in the idea of civic nationalism, which I've gone into in some detail in the book, liberal democracy is indispensable, because the institutions of liberal democracy are what enable participation in the institutions, processes, and practices of civic nationalism. So if you want to be a civic nationalist, it can only be within a democracy. The moment democracy is suspended, those institutions cannot function democratically, and then the nation ceases to fulfill the basic requirements of civic nationalism. Then it goes completely into the territory that people like Rabindranath Tagore, George Orwell, and certainly myself reject utterly, this ethno-religious identified nationalism. You call it majoritarianism, you call it Hindu Rashtra, whatever. That is not what India has civilizationally been about, and that is not what the Constitution prescribes. I might add that one of the critiques I get from the Hindutva right for my arguments and my writing over the years is Shashi Tharoor writes as if India was born in 1950 with the Constitution. That is utter nonsense. We are an ancient civilization. To which my answer is, I acknowledge in all my writings that we are an ancient civilization. But my understanding of what our ancient civilization consists of and stands for is actually anchored in the evidence of texts, of documents, of historical movements that demonstrate a faith in pluralism, in multiplicity of worship, in multiplicity of lives and coexistence, whereas they take our ancient civilization as if it was some frozen, static idea of some sort of pure and pristine Hindu Rashtra that they are now replicating today. Actually, a Hindu Rashtra today or tomorrow would be fundamentally unhistorical and would be a betrayal of the ancient civilization in whose name they claim to be constructing it.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor, for that spirited defense of civic nationalism. And all of us, in a sense, must wish ourselves at least some limited success in stopping this onward march of the battle of belonging, in which Hindu nationalism seems to be having an upper hand right now. So on behalf of the organizers, the host, and our audience, I thank you and open the floor, since we are about 12 minutes, 10 to 12 minutes we have, and therefore I will not speak anything anymore. I will just, if you can't, I can read out the question.
Sure, but I can see it on the screen now. Secularism existed even before the word was incorporated. He's totally correct. In fact, what is interesting is that the Constitution, whether you add the word secular or not, is for secular assumptions. For example, the freedom of worship. the freedom to propagate your own religion, the equality of all citizens irrespective of background. And that is unfortunately the antithesis of Hindutva. The questioner says Hindutva is what held the country together. Nonsense. Hindutva actually divides the country by saying that some are more equal than others. So I think that even if today you remove the word secular from the constitution, our constitution remains a secular constitution. But whether Hinduism binds the nation, that's a different matter. We can talk about Hinduism as I understand it and as the questioner understands it, Mr. Prabhu. But if Mr. Prabhu says Hindutva binds the nation, it does not, because Hindutva is an exclusionary political doctrine, not an inclusive one. Okay, so this is an interesting question from Mona Shah about nationalism being a dynamic concept that no one has been able to do help Indians understand why we remain together despite our diversity and foreign hegemony, she says, for almost 1,000 years. Well, first of all, Mona, I would argue that there is a difference between the quote-unquote foreign hegemony before the British, which to my mind ceased to be foreign within one generation. Because those who came and looted and left, they don't belong to us, whether it's Ghazni or Ghori or Ahmad Shah Abdali. They came, they looted, they left. I consider them foreign invaders. But those who came and stayed and married here and had children here, and those children went on to rule, and their children, also the products of local wives and so on, continue to rule, how can you call them foreign? To my mind, the Mughal emperors are as Indian as you and me. They have contributed as much. And indeed, even if they may have exploited people through taxes or other forms of loot, they spent that here. They weren't sending them off to Samarkand or Bukhara the way the English sent off our resources to London by draining our treasury. So there is a big difference. We have only, as a country, in my view, suffered 200 years of foreign rule, not 1,000. And multiple books of mine have tried to explain the answer to Mona Shah's question as to why we have stayed together. I would point her to India from Midnight to the Millennium, which was my book in 1997 about the first 50 years of India's independence. I would point her to An Era of Darkness, which is my study of the British colonial exactions in our country. I would point her to Why I'm a Hindu, and I would point her now to this book, because this book seeks in many ways. I mean, when Dr. Palshikar talked about a sequel, I have to confess, I was thinking already, groaning inwardly and saying, oh no, because I really feel I have said everything I want to say about these subjects in so many different ways that I think it's time I move on to a totally different set of issues and themes, just to give my own mind a break from its obsession with these issues of Indian nationhood, India's identity, India's contemporary politics. Unfortunately, I live and breathe it all day long in my political life as well. So I think in all fairness, you need to give me a break, Dr. Palshikar.
Dr. Tharoor, you can turn to fiction again.
I think I should turn to fiction again. Then maybe the only escape from the oppression of reality. What is the need of the hour for the safeguard of institutions? I mean, we've answered this question, Arun G, because Dr. Palshikar and I actually discussed this very issue of the great importance of institutions, of autonomous institutions, and how the Constitution itself privileges a notion of democracy that requires the strengthening and preservation of that institution. Thank you, Mr. Shamal Rao Mahuduru, for liking this We Are All Minorities. I've argued in earlier books as well, but let me repeat that the logic in saying that is that because we have multiple ways of seeing our identity, when a journalist uses that phrase, majority community, I always consider him or her a lazy journalist. Because, it's possible that a Hindi-speaking Hindu male from Uttar Pradesh fancies himself to be a member of the majority community. But if he steps off a train in a railway station in Kerala, he'll find that he's not a majority in any meaningful sense of the term. Number one, nobody around him is speaking Hindi, so there he is in a minority. Number two, nobody will identify with his dress, food habits, manner of eating. Perhaps the moment you ask what his caste is, he'll find that he belongs to a caste that represents a minority. And finally, if he's in Kerala, he'll discover that even his gender puts him in a minority, because a majority of Keralites living in Kerala are female. So at the end of the day, you can find many ways of slicing and dicing us. I think it's healthy to recognize that we are all minorities, but collectively we constitute something really precious. I've often said we are secure in these different identities of saying I'm a proud Gaud Saraswat Brahmin, or I'm a proud Tamil, or I'm a proud Muslim, or whatever. We're secure in those different identities because we are ultimately kept secure by that sheltering carapace of the Indian identity. And to my mind, that is the way in which an identity of nationalism that is made up of many minorities, a notion of patriotism that adds up a lot of local patriotisms, this kind of pluralism, to my mind, is a depiction of India that I find incredibly precious and worth fighting for. Sorry, I think there was one more question that popped up on the screen. Oh, I don't want to answer that. I'm not, if by that question you are implying that I should acknowledge that the present Prime Minister has a very difficult job, I would agree that all the Prime Ministers have a difficult job. They're all handling a challenging country. But I would argue that the present Prime Minister has made his job more difficult by decisions he didn't need to take, by sentiments he didn't need to express, by frankly, exclusions he didn't need to impose, and by a delegitimization of the safety valve of dissent. All of which I think would have, if none of those mistakes had been made, he would have probably found India far better to handle. Because India saw in him in 2014 an inspirational leader speaking about development and growth and prosperity and jobs. And most Indians really want that. I mean, certainly for me, what my message used to be when I first came into politics was all about development, progress, aspiration. One of the first things I said in Hindi, and having come in after 3.5 decades living abroad, was हर भारतवासी को पूछना है कि मुझ में क्या कमी है? Why can't we do what the rest of the world is doing? Why can't we be as good as all those countries that have succeeded and thrived? And I believe we can. And that was the message that resonated. I've been sidetracked by the rise of Mr. Modi and company into focusing all my energies on contesting the ideological battleground of Hindutva, Hinduism, national identity, and so on, precisely because, unfortunately, they have moved away from the aspirations of most Indians into territory which actually had been settled in the Constituent Assembly 70 years ago. The irony is all their assumptions had already been discussed. If you read the debates in the Constituent Assembly, and I can't even claim to have read every word, but I've read certainly more than half of the speeches in the Constituent Assembly. I've seen every issue, including the argument now that Pakistan's been created for Muslims, why can't we have a country for Hindus? That was discussed and thrashed out. Now, all these issues that were settled, why are we reopening them again? What a negative, regressive, pointless diversion of our country from the great task of just giving decent lives to our people and helping India to fulfill its genuine potential on the world stage. Could we hope to see a political fiction centering around the different aspects of the Battle of Belonging? You know, I do want to go back to fiction, Catherine Abraham. I will say that as far as my own experience as a writer is concerned, every time I publish a book, I get deluged with questions, whether on social media these days, or sometimes people reaching out to me directly saying, why have you not written fiction again? Because my last novel was published in 2001. So we are going to have at least 20 years between that one and the next one, possibly more than 20. And the truth is that I really do want to do that. I am certainly going to partly blame my publishers because they have been nagging and pushing me into the books that I have indeed written in the last few years. And now with the 75th anniversary of India's independence looming and a desire to see some more nonfiction. But my next major project, the project that, if you like, will represent for me a departure from the concerns of my last few books, will be fiction. And undoubtedly some of the themes that have exercised me in my writing will not be absent from it. Because even in my fiction, if you read my novel Riot, it does prefigure many of these debates about nationalism, nationhood, belonging, that in a different way, in different terms, have been reprised decades later in this book. So yes, perhaps I can go back to fiction and address these issues from a different perspective.
So thank you very much. All of us know that facts are really crazier than what fiction can be. And
Totally.
also we know that in fiction as well, there would be shadows of politics that Dr. Tharoor does. He is a politician who also happens to be a very fine intellectual, giving us guidance and ideas to toy with, to fight with. So this Battle of Belonging is one of those books. It has been a great pleasure for the Pune International Literary Festival to have him with us this afternoon, and we hope that we will have more of Dr. Tharoor and his ideas for discussing, for fighting with him, and for agreeing with him as well. So thank you, Dr. Tharoor, and thank you, PILF, for having me talk to Dr. Tharoor. That was a great pleasure.
Thank you very much, Dr. Palsikar, for your stimulating questions and for doing me the honor of engaging with these ideas. I think it's been one of the best conversations I've had on the book. And let's hope next time it'll be in person in a post-COVID Pune. I look forward to seeing you all again.
Great. Thank you.
Namaskar. Thank you and Jai Hind.
Well, a very big thank you to everybody, to all the speakers for taking time out of your very busy schedules. And Dr. Tharoor, PILF always looks forward to every single one of your sessions every year. Trust me, they're the most enriching ones. So thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules. And here's an announcement for all of our viewers. Our next session begins at 5:30 p.m. after a break of 15 minutes. Thank you so much.